How many of you were popular in school? Raise your hands. No one ever admits to being popular, except for my wife, but no one ever wants to admit to that. Well, this is going to come as no surprise to you, no surprise at all to anybody here, but I was not popular when I was in school. You picked up by now that I'm pretty nerdy, and so I was not the cool kid in school. I wasn't like a social pariah or an outcast either, but I didn't get invited to all the cool kid parties. And like any other insecure middle schooler or high schooler, I always sort of wondered, what was it like to be with the in crowd, the cool kids, the ones who everybody seemed to know and look up to? So one day, out of the blue, I got invited to a birthday party of the most popular girl in my school. And I didn't know this at the time, but the reason why I got invited was apparently her cousin had a crush on me. And so pressured the popular girl to invite me to the birthday party. Anyways, that's just a sidebar. But so all of the popular kids in my school were going to be at this party, and I was finally going to see what it was like at the top with the cool kids. So I show up to the party. I'm feeling pretty awkward, but trying to be kind of cool and confident as I'm in this party. And as the party progresses, somebody suggests playing Spin the Bottle. Did anybody else play this game at parties or anything like that? Okay, I'd never played Spin the Bottle, and I've never played Spin the Bottle since. But I don't know if this is how it's normally played, but this is how they were playing it. So you would spin the bottle, and whoever, in our case, it was like a 2-liter plastic bottle. We didn't have glass bottles, but you'd spin the bottle, and whoever it pointed at, they either had to give you a kiss, or you could give them a dare to do, something that they would have to do. It's kind of like truth or dare, but involving kissing. So anyways, the most popular girl whose birthday it is, she goes first, and she spins the bottle, and it points directly at me. And I'm not kidding you. Like, people had kept some space for me. It, pointed directly at me. And so being completely mortified at the thought of trying to kiss the most popular girl while all of the popular kids are arrayed around us in a circle, I opted for the dare. And this was the dare that she came up with for me. She said, put your pants around your knees and run around the house. Run around my house outside. Now, this was the era of baggy clothes. So I had the big t-shirt, so nothing was going to be exposed. And I was like, no problem. And I was just trying to be really kind of cocky and arrogant. So I put the pants around my knees, and I start running around the house until I get to the side of the house where they had a fence. And as everybody's watching me, I'm like, I'm going to be cool and show them I can leap this fence. So I grab the top of the fence, and my pants catch on the top of the fence. And I just come swinging down on the other side of the fence and smack into the fence with my pants above my head and my shirt down around my head. While all of the popular kids at my school are watching, and yes, a neighbor came out at just that moment to take their trash out to the sight of me hanging upside down by my pants. I was completely humiliated. Jesus' words could have applied to me from the gospel reading. And then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. This is the warning that Jesus is bringing to the Pharisees, who are jockeying for position in their own little cool clique. Jesus is attending this banquet, and he notices how the Pharisees and these scholars and kind of the upper middle class folks are kind of jockeying for position to show who is the best and the brightest and the furthest ahead. And as he's watching them at this banquet, he starts to criticize them. I want to explain a little bit about what these banquets were like. So we don't quite have the same equivalent in our own culture. They were called symposia, and they got it from the Greeks and the Romans, and the Jews are kind of copying them. And they were these banquets where you would go and debate philosophical ideas together. And it's sometimes like political groups would do this, or religious groups, or kind of the educated elite, and they would go to these symposia, and they would share a meal, and they would try to kind of one-up each other. In these dinner parties, humility was seen as a vice, not a virtue. Because the whole point was that you were supposed to argue from a place of confidence in your own ideas, that your ideas were superior. The object was to best everybody else at the table. And so Jesus, they've invited Jesus there, not say, hey, Jesus, come have a relaxing, fun dinner party like we might do with our friends or something like that. They're inviting Jesus to put his ideas to the test. It's a setup. It's a trap. They're trying to get him to come so that they can humiliate him with how pathetic his teachings and ideas are. They're luring him in. And so it says that they were watching him closely. They were watching him closely. But they're not the only ones who are watching closely. Jesus is watching them closely. It says that Jesus noticed how they chose the places of honor at the banquet. And as he's seeing that, as he's witnessing them jockeying for position, trying to one-up each other, trying to get the best seats, right, to show that their ideas were important and better than anybody else's, Jesus speaks a prophetic word to them. He says to them, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." This was countercultural. It went against the grain of the whole event. But humility is always countercultural. I have not discovered the culture. Maybe there's a ethnographer out there who can tell me about another culture, but I've yet to discover the culture where humility is celebrated, where humility is held up. But in the Bible, humility is the very soil in which all the other virtues grow. You cannot grow spiritually until you embrace humility. Because humility is when we're being honest. Humility is primarily about being honest with who we are in the presence of God. That's what it's about. And I think a lot of cultures, including our own, they kind of embrace these false ideas about humility. They embrace a false humility. So I want to just clarify what I'm not talking about, some kind of false ideas that we might have about humility. Humility is not the same as being self-deprecating. It's not about putting yourself down. Because I think sometimes that's how people talk about it, right? I've even used the word humiliation, right? It's when you're humiliated, when you're put down. Putting yourself down or being self-deprecating is just as dishonoring to God as when you put someone else down. So when we talk negatively about ourselves or put ourselves down, that's just as dishonoring to God as when we talk negative about others. And the reason for that is because you are made in the image of God. You are made in the image of God. You are his beloved child, the delight of his heart. And so when you are talking negative about yourself and putting yourself down, you are leading an assault on the image of God. You're denying that truth that God loves you and made you as an object of his delight and pleasure. Rick Warren writes, "True humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less." I like the way that Carol put that, that Jesus, others, and you. It's okay, that's the order. We're just thinking of ourselves less, not thinking less of ourselves. And the other thing I want to say is that humility is not the same as false humility. We can sometimes use false humility to try to get others to boost us up, right? We'll pretend like we're putting ourselves down so that others come around us and say, "Oh, no, you're whatever," kind of build us up. The difference between being self-deprecating and false humility is that when we're self-deprecating, we actually think less of ourselves. But when we practice false humility, we pretend to think less of ourselves, right? And we've all done this. We do this a lot in our culture. We'll pretend to put ourselves down to get others to build us up. But humility is about the inward condition of the heart, not the outward expression of our mouths. You can say the most humble things about yourselves, and you can appear to be the most humble person on earth. But if you don't have humility in your heart, then it's all a farce. God knows the difference. He knows your heart. He knows when you're judging others or looking down on others. He knows whether it's real humility or false humility. He's not fooled by us. So if true humility is not being self-deprecating or false humility, what is it? What does it mean to be humble? What does a humble life and heart look like? Well, I want to just highlight two things. There's a lot of things I could say. There's a really great book by Andrew Murray called, it's creatively titled Humility, about humility, that I highly recommend to you. But I just want to highlight two things that our readings kind of bring to the fore about humility. The first, two things, and I'll tell you what they are first. That true humility is both compassionate and fearless. When you are operating out of humility, you are compassionate and fearless. So first, compassionate. True humility has compassion at its core. When you have true humility, you're able to empathize with others. When you're proud, when you're filled up with pride, you distance yourself from others. You tend to think, when you're in a position of pride, that your good fortune is because of you, and the misfortune of others is because of them, and they're just worse people than you, or something like that. But when you're humble, you do the reverse. You assume your good fortune is because of God's grace. It's to His credit. And that the misfortune of others is something that you're responsible for to help alleviate. This is what our reading from Hebrews 13 is all about. The author writes this: "Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Notice how the author of Hebrews is doing that, going back to Carol's thing, like, treat others as if they might be angels, right? Treat them as if they might actually be better than you in some ways. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. When you are in a place of humility, there is no one in this world that you cannot identify with. You can identify with the worst criminal when you're operating from a place of humility. You can identify with anybody when you're operating from a place of humility. Humble people are able to see things from the perspective of others, because they don't imagine themselves to be looking down from a distance upon others. We're called to provide hospitality to strangers, and here literally it just means foreigners. We're called to remember those in prison, to go and spend time with them. Humility enables us to empathize with everyone, regardless of their circumstances. Now, the Pharisees didn't operate that way. The Pharisees operated from a place of pride. And in fact, they had specific beliefs that kind of reinforced their pride. They're differentiating themselves from others. The Pharisees believed that when God came to judge the earth, that there would be this big banquet, and it would be like a wedding feast. Notice that Jesus in his parable says it's a wedding feast, right? He tells this story about a wedding feast. So they had this vision that at the end of time, when God came to judge the world, there'd be this big wedding feast. Except for there would be three types of people that would be excluded from joining the wedding feast. There'd be a feast for anyone who wanted to come, except for these three groups of people. Here are the three classes of people that they thought were excluded: the crippled, the lame, and the blind had no place at God's table when His kingdom came on earth. Listen again to what Jesus says to them. Jesus said to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Jesus is directly challenging their view that these types of people, we're better than them. We are special and they are not. They're excluded and we're included. You know, I think in the church, we may not say, oh, if you're crippled or lame or blind, you have no place here. We don't do that anymore. But I wonder if we have our own way of distancing ourselves from those who are different, of not engaging and loving those who are different from us. I wonder how much of our compassion in the church today is quid pro quo compassion. I have compassion on those who I know could someday have compassion on me and help me out, where it's not going to just be a one-way street. And here, I want to point out that Jesus is saying that we're called to help those who can never help us back. That's how we proclaim that we're not on this earth to help ourselves, but our help is in the name of the Lord. We're not looking to boost ourselves up. True humility is compassionate. Second, humility makes you fearless. In the ancient world, most fears and anxieties were a little different than ours. They worried about things like, will I have enough to eat? And that's still true in many parts of the world. We typically in America, there are some places and some people who do struggle with food insecurity. But in general, we don't tend to worry about, am I going to get another meal today? Will I be able to clothe my children? These were kinds of fears that were common among the commoners in Jesus' day. And he addresses, when he's in the Sermon on the Mount, he's got this huge crowd, and those are the kinds of fears that he talks about. But this is a very different crowd that he's hanging out with at this banquet. These are respected community leaders and scholars. They're the middle and the upper class, and so their fears are different, and I think their fears are maybe more similar to our own. So what are their fears? Most of their fears and anxiety were anchored in the fear of losing social status, position, or power. Just as we often have fears about those things. And what Jesus is doing is he's inviting them to step out of this positional rat race, the fear of looking foolish or out of step with the crowd, the fear of not being seen as successful or competent. And Jesus is directly addressing these fears and saying, don't be afraid to take the low seat. Don't let your fear control you. True humility is fearless. When you're humble, you don't have to chase the approval and applause of others. A truly humble heart is not insecure. It is perfectly secure before the Lord. One of my heroes is St. Francis, and during my sabbatical, some of you probably know this, I got to go to Assisi and see where he grew up, where he lived, and where he got called to follow Jesus and really changed the whole shape of the world through the religious order he started, the Franciscans. And St. Francis, he was just an amazing man, but he was a very humble man. He was the son of a cloth merchant. And he got started on his path to sainthood when one day he was in the market and he was selling cloth for his father. He worked his father's little booth. His father was kind of like upper middle class, and he's selling the cloth, this expensive cloth. And he sees a poor man going past who's very poor and going by in rags. And at that moment, St. Francis is overcome with compassion for him, and he takes all of the earnings from that day, all the money that he'd collected from selling the cloth, and he goes and chases after the man through the market and gives him all the money. Felt like the Lord just told him to do it in that moment, and so he goes and does it, as crazy as it is. And actually, later he went on to, like a few days later, he actually sold all of the cloth in his father's market and gave all that money to the church, which his dad was not happy about. Actually brought him up on charges of theft. But anyways, that's another story for another time. But my point, what stands out to me most was that St. Francis was absolutely fearless. Even in that moment, he wasn't afraid to look like a fool in his society and culture chasing after a poor man to give him money. He wasn't afraid of his father being angry with him for giving away the family earnings from that day of sales. He was fearless. If you have no pride and nothing to lose, then there is nothing you can't or won't do for Jesus. If you have no pride and you have nothing to lose, there is nothing that will stop you from following Jesus. There's nothing you won't do. St. Francis referred to himself and his followers as jongleurs de Dieu, which just means the jugglers of God. They were like court jesters at his time in the 1200s. These court jesters could get away with doing ridiculous things in front of the king because they were there to entertain. So they could say offensive things to the king, they could mock him, they could do all these things because it was funny. And they could kind of get away with being over the top and ridiculous. And so he called him and his followers, we're jugglers of God. We can operate outside the normal rules of society just by being fully humble and devoted to the Lord because we have nothing to lose. We don't care if people laugh at us or think that we're complete idiots. One of the things that he did was there was a crusade going on, the Fifth Crusade in Egypt. And so he saw this and felt like he was called to go to where the battle was and try to bring peace between the two warring sides, the Crusaders and this sultan that they were attacking in Egypt. And so what he did is he just showed up in his rags, he dressed like a beggar, and he just walked straight onto the battlefield, walked across the battlefield from his side's lines to the other side lines. He just walked up to them and just said, "Hi, I'd like to see the Sultan." And they didn't know what to do with this guy because he was completely fearless, he was unarmed, and he just walked straight up to them. And so they figured, we don't know if this guy's crazy or if this is like some kind of special sign from God or something. So they took him to the Sultan. And so St. Francis goes before the Sultan and he just starts telling the Sultan all about Jesus, telling him all about the good news of Jesus. And the Sultan is sitting there like, what is this guy doing here? Why is he here? But he listens to him and hears him out. And he tries to make peace between the sides. He wasn't successful at bringing peace between the two sides. But here was St. Francis in this royal court, not caring what anybody thought of him, not caring even that the Crusaders might think that he was a traitor and joining the other side, not caring because he's able to operate. In his humility, he does not care if he looks like a fool. He has no pride left. One time a bishop saw the extreme poverty that the Franciscans lived in and was horrified by what he saw. And St. Francis said to him these words. He said, "If we had any possessions, we should need weapons and laws to defend them." G.K. Chesterton writes this about it. He said, St. Francis's argument was this, that the dedicated man might go anywhere among any kind of men, even the worst kind of men, so long as there was nothing by which they could hold him. What could you do to St. Francis? He had nothing. There's nothing you could take from him, and so there's nothing he wasn't willing to do. His humility, the humility of St. Francis, enabled him to live for an audience of one. True humility is the courage to live for an audience of one. True humility can go against the crowd. True humility can be free to do the right thing no matter whether it's popular or not. Because the humble heart doesn't need to be exalted by the crowd. The humble heart is waiting to be exalted by the audience of one, by God, the Lord Almighty, the judge of the living and the dead. And with the author of Hebrews, the humble heart can confidently say, "The Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me?" What can man do to me? In the end, it is only the Lord's audience that counts. And that audience doesn't change. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you." Isn't that good? That's a good line. C.S. Lewis. Jesus humbled himself. He became like us. In Jesus, God humbled himself to empathize with us. He set us an example. He embraced the most humbling death on a cross for us. He humbled himself all the way to be with us, out of compassion for us, out of love for us. He's willing to be made a fool of, to be mocked and spit on. And he died for us out of that compassion. It was Jesus' humility that led St. Francis down the path of humility. That's what inspired him, was looking at Jesus. I wish I could tell you there's like a 3-step plan to becoming more humble, and I could just like hand it to you, like, do these 3 things and you will be the most humble person ever. That's not how it works. You're not, there's not an easy path to cultivate humility. But I want to offer you something that Mother Teresa wrote. This is a list that she made of ways to practice humility. And I just wonder if, as I read them, if one of them maybe hits home with you. Maybe one is just going to like pop out to you and be the word of the Lord for you today. Here's what she wrote. She said, "These are the few ways we can practice humility. To speak as little as possible of oneself. To mind one's own business. Not to want to manage other people's affairs. To accept contradictions and correction cheerfully. To pass over the mistakes of others. To accept insults and injuries. To accept being slighted, forgotten, and disliked. To be kind and gentle, even under provocation. Never to stand on one's dignity. To choose always the hardest." Fearless humility. Not afraid of being wrong or looking foolish. Not afraid of risking it all. True humility lives fearlessly. Because everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. And he who humbles himself will be exalted. Amen.